So I'm going to start by telling you a story, and it actually is the first story in my book. And it's the story of a British scientist, a guy named Francis Galton. So about a century ago, Francis Galton was at a country fair in the west of England. And this was a fair much like the ones we have here in the States. People would come, they'd bring their livestock and their produce and show it off to each other. And as Galton was walking through the fair that day, he came across this contest. And the contest was that an ox had been placed on display. And people were lined up to guess the weight of the ox. So you would pay 6 pence, and the best guesses would win prizes. So people had some incentive to try to do a good job of guessing the weight of this ox. Now, as Galton described it, the crowd that day was actually a very big one. So it was between like 700 to 800 people were there to actually take a flyer on this contest. And the other thing about the crowd that was important was that it was also a relatively diverse crowd. So that while some of the people in the crowd were butchers and farmers, people for whom doing something like being able to guess the weight of an ox was probably pretty important, a lot of the people in the crowd were not experts. They were local merchants, family members, clerks, whatever. Just people who were there having a nice day out at the fair and thought they would, basically take a guess at how much this ox weighed. So these were people who, at least on the surface, did not really have any kind of insider knowledge of cattle, basically. So after the contest was over, Galton took all of the guesses, and he ran a series of tests on them. He graphed them from high to low to see if they formed a bell curve. He calculated the standard deviation of the guesses. And then he did something very simple. He just took the average of the group's guesses. Now that number represented, I'll say, the kind of collective wisdom of the group. So if it had been one person, that's how much it would have guessed the ox had weighed. Now, Francis Galton was a brilliant scientist, but he was also, and it's important to know this, he was also a notorious elitist. He really thought that only a very few people in the world had the capabilities necessary to make good decisions, to contribute to answers, and so on. So when he took the average of the group's guesses, what he thought was that he was going to find that the group was way off the mark. Because in his mind, what you were doing was you were taking the guesses of a few smart people, a few mediocre people, and then a lot of morons, because he basically thought everyone was dumb. And so collectively, you were going to end up with a really flawed answer. But as it happened, Galton was wrong, because the crowd had guessed that the ox would weigh 1,197 pounds. And when all was said and done, the ox weighed 1,198 pounds. So in other words, the crowd's judgment was essentially perfect. And what I want to talk to you about today is the idea that this is not really a coincidence. That in fact, it was an example of a very powerful and incredibly useful phenomenon, one that in the right conditions you all already are tapping into and certainly can tap into going forward. And it's this phenomenon that I dub the wisdom of crowds. The idea of it is very simple. It's that under the right conditions, groups of people can be remarkably intelligent. And they can actually be smarter than the smartest person in that group. And what that means is that if you can figure out ways to tap into the collective intelligence of your communities, communities inside organizations, outside organizations, that you can actually do a great job of making better decisions, of driving innovation, of, in some cases, actually doing a better job of forecasting the future. Now, the key to that definition is that phrase, under the right conditions. That's sort of my way out of the problem. Because obviously, we can all think of many examples in which crowds are far from wise, right? We can think of examples in which crowds are foolish, in which they're extreme. I literally just finished reading a book about the Salem witch trials. That's an example of an entire community that basically went crazy for about 8 months. And you can also think of crowds and groups and teams that are really mediocre in their judgment, very lowest common denominator. And so the challenge really is, and in a sense, it's the challenge that I think you all face, is how do you make sure your community is actually tapping into that collective wisdom, that collective energy? Because when you can do that, the results can actually be extraordinary. And I think actually the talk that actually just gave actually speaks to that, to the power that a crowd has when you actually are able to access that knowledge and that intensity that communities oftentimes possess. Now, you can actually see the wisdom of crowds at work in many different ways. You can see it in very simple problems, and I'm only going to go through these very quickly. But if you can see it in very simple problems. So if I asked all of you to guess how many jelly beans were in a jar, your collective answer would be exceptionally good. It'd probably be better than about 95% of the people in the room, and it'd be within 2 or 3% of the number of beans in the jar. A few of you would probably do better than the group as a whole, but if we did it, say, 3 or 4 times with 3 or 4 different jars of jelly beans, which would be a really fascinating way for you to spend your day, what you would find is that no one person actually did better than the group as a whole. Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? The crowd, when you actually polled the audience, when you used to be able to do that on the show, the audience got the answer right 91% of the time. The internet, obviously, is an unparalleled tool for accessing collective intelligence, and you can see it really all through the internet. I mean, the greatest and most powerful example is Google's search engine, which at the heart of it is really the PageRank algorithm, which is in effect a kind of tool for tapping the collective intelligence of the web. But you can also see it in Wikipedia. You can see it in companies that try to tap into the collective intelligence of their users, like Threadless. NASA has used the collective intelligence of people on the web to try to actually diagnose craters on Mars. There's sort of myriad examples of this. And the collective intelligence also is useful for actually thinking about the future. So my favorite example of the wisdom of crowds in action comes from kind of a strange place, which is the racetrack. And that is, at the racetrack, the odds-on horses predict almost perfectly how likely a horse is to win. And those odds are set not by some one smart individual. They're actually set by the community of bettors. And collectively, they do an extraordinarily good job of actually predicting the future. Another place where you can see it, which is actually relevant right now, are what are sometimes called prediction markets. So you can actually go to these markets, and you'll see they're trying to predict the outcome of elections. They're trying to predict the outcome of other kinds of events. The track record of those markets over the last 2.5 decades has been exceptionally good, actually better than polls and better than pundits. Although I have to say, even the prediction markets did not do a great job of forecasting the rise of Trump. The point here is that if you can figure out ways to actually access that knowledge, the knowledge that communities have, and online communities in particular are tremendously valuable because they allow you to cast a very wide net and to actually access and integrate information in a really efficient way, you can really add tremendous value to your companies and to the community itself. And I would argue even beyond that to sort of the world at large. The challenge, though, is really figuring out how do you do that. So what are the characteristics that make a crowd wise? What are the characteristics that distinguish an intelligent, valuable community from one that is essentially the equivalent of a mob or a very sort of mediocre team? So that's what I'm going to talk about now. I think there are essentially 3 fundamental conditions that distinguish wise crowds from foolish ones. The first one is somewhat complex when it comes to community management. And that is that one of the tools that can be very valuable is to find ways of aggregating the individual judgments and opinions of your users and to produce a kind of collective judgment. Now, obviously, you can't do this with comments and things like that. But what it does mean is that if you can find ways to actually tap into that intelligence in an aggregate way, so via polls, via surveys, via voting systems like you see at something like Reddit, what that allows you to do is actually surface the kind of collective knowledge of the group in a way that's harder to do on a simple sort of comment-by-comment basis or even when you're doing sort of individual surveys and the like. So I actually highly recommend, as much as possible, if you can find ways to tap into that kind of aggregate knowledge, the results can actually be tremendously powerful. And a couple recommendations for how you can do this, and that can be useful. It oftentimes is useful when you're asking people something. Let's say you're trying to get them to evaluate a new product or new services. Or let's say you're trying to get them to think about, if you're a technology company, you're trying to get them to think about what the future of the industry or of a particular technology looks like. It can actually be useful to ask them questions that, rather than being yes-no questions, actually ask them to think about how likely or unlikely they think things are to be. So to actually ask them, what probability you think, how likely do you think this is, 70% or 30%? Another way to do that is to essentially give them a sort of limited range of units or votes, and basically say you can distribute these across the choices however you want. And what that allows you to get at is the kind of intensity of people's opinions and the intensity of people's preferences. And when you actually aggregate all of those choices, what you're likely to end up with is an exceptionally good picture, both of what the community thinks, and then oftentimes what that will translate into is a very good picture of whatever the answer is you're actually looking for. So aggregation is very important, but it's not as important as the second and third characteristics of wise crowds. The second one, which I would argue is probably the most important, is diversity. Now, by diversity, we hear a lot about diversity in the corporate world, a lot about it in the nonprofit world. When I talk about diversity, what I really mean is that you want people who are thinking about problems from many different angles and using different kinds of tools to think about and communicate about those problems. So when I talk about diversity, what I'm really talking about is a kind of cognitive diversity more than a traditional kind of diversity of background or sort of sociological diversity. Sociological diversity can be really valuable in many respects, but it's especially valuable insofar as it informs cognitive diversity. So you really want people who are thinking about problems in lots of different ways. Now, obviously in any community, this is a little bit of a challenge because to some degree, your communities are self-selected, right? There's a certain homogeneity in any online community because some people are really interested in the subject or the technology or the company, and other people just aren't. But I think the goal is that even within that group, you can still have cognitive diversity. You can still have people who are actually thinking about problems in different ways, who are actually offering different kinds of opinions. And I actually think as community managers, finding ways to actually amplify diversity and to allow the diversity that's there in the community to surface, to rise to the surface, is actually a tremendously valuable thing to be able to do. Now, diversity is really important for a couple of reasons. The first reason, and this is kind of obvious, is it just means that you have access to more information, right? It means that more information is available in the group than it otherwise would be. There's a great experiment that a political scientist at the University of Michigan did to demonstrate this. There's a guy named Scott Page who's done a lot of work on why diversity is so valuable. He does this experiment with computer agents because that allows him to actually look and see how these agents are solving problems. What he does is he takes a very large group of computer agents and he has them solve individually, each of them, a very complicated math problem. When he's done, he can actually look at how they've done and he can rank them. So some of them are exceptionally good, some of them are pretty good, and then some of them are just mediocre. Then what he does is he divides them into two groups. One of them is made up of the best of the problem solvers, the cream of the crop. The second group, though, is assembled at random. So it includes some of the best, some of the okay, and then some of the mediocre. Then he has them solve a new math problem, but this time he has them do it collectively. So they solve them as groups. And what he finds is that although the best of the best group does well, it's outperformed by the random group about 90% of the time. Now, the random group's average IQ is lower, but its collective intelligence is actually greater. And the idea here is that not that you want to bring stupid people into your community, but that what you do want to do is you want to bring diversity of knowledge and opinion. Because even though the people at the lower end of the spectrum, they know less, it turns out that when they're part of a group, they actually add value. Because they're thinking about the problem in different ways. And the groups they're part of end up exploring a sort of wider solution space. And they end up actually being better at sort of arriving at answers and not getting hung up on in little corners, basically. And so the idea is that even if you know less, you can actually add value as long as what you know is different. So one way to think about this in terms of a community is, the role of newbies. So newbies take a lot of flack, at least in my experience, in the communities that I'm part of. But actually, what Page's work suggests and what the importance of diversity suggests is that new users can actually add tremendous value. Because oftentimes they can ask questions or think about problems that maybe the community has sort of already forgotten about or already decided it knows the answer to. And I think one of the things you really want to do is try to keep new blood coming in and also helping it sort of make an impression, as well as respecting the knowledge of veterans and the like. Now, diversity is also important, and this is challenging, in the sense that it actually keeps the group from where everyone's making the same kind of mistake. So there's a joke about actuaries, which is probably the only joke about actuaries. And the joke is that these three actuaries are out hunting, and a goose flies overhead, and one of them fires and misses 20 feet to the left. The other one fires and misses 20 feet to the right. And the third one jumps up and down and says, "We got it." So that's how actuarial work works. You sort of bracket it. And that's actually how the wisdom of crowd works as well. Any one individual is going to be too optimistic, too pessimistic, have a certain opinion that's off in some way, and others going to have an opinion that's off in the other way. But if you have a diverse group where people are making, in a sense, all kinds of mistakes, what you end up with actually is a collective where the answer is really right on, or can be very close to being right on the answer. And the problem is that when the group is really homogeneous, then that's when you end up with groups that are actually much more likely to be way, way off the mark. Now that flows into the third thing you really need, and I would say actually for what you all do, this is probably the biggest challenge. And that is, wise crowds are crowds that are made up of people who are, to some degree, independent thinkers. So independence is really important when it comes to collective intelligence. Now by independence, I don't mean something pure or utopian. What I really mean is that people are relying on their own judgment, their own intuitions when they offer up opinions, rather than spending a lot of time looking at what others are doing and mimicking or copying them. Now, the challenge, obviously, is that the online environment, and social media in particular, is in some ways a tool to actually get people to copy what other people are doing. If you think about sort of the way Twitter works and retweets and the rest of it, a lot of it is about sort of trying to create imitation, trying to create information cascades where everyone is sort of doing what other people are doing. But when it comes to communities, if you really want to harvest the knowledge that users have, or if you're doing a community inside a company, if you're really trying to harvest the knowledge that workers have, what you want to try to do is create mechanisms that allow people to actually think for themselves and express their own opinions. And let me just say two things about how that works. One, I think, is this gives you a sense of why moderation and curation can be important. Because to the degree that you can help shape discussions so that certain voices don't drown out everybody else, you actually make it easier for people to be independent. The second aspect of this is that when you do things that are trying to tap into the knowledge of your users in a kind of direct way, so polls or surveys or studies of this kind, it actually is valuable if when you ask people to give you their answer, they don't know what everybody else thinks. So in general, oftentimes you'll find that online. If you want to, say, answer a poll on some site, you oftentimes don't get the answer until afterwards. But in a lot of cases, the answer is already right there in front of you. And when that happens, it is very difficult for people to think for themselves. Because the reality of independence is that even though we all pride ourselves on being independent, I mean, very few of us wake up in the morning and say, I'm really looking forward to conforming today. The reality is that we spend a lot of time looking at what other people are doing and doing maybe not exactly the same thing, but something close to it. And we do that because the knowledge other people have is useful to us. It oftentimes is going to give us a good answer. The problem is that when everyone in a community, or most of the people, are doing that, in other words, paying attention to what other people are doing, paying attention to what the loudest voice is, or the person who has the most karma says, or whatever it is, then the crowd is no longer going to be wise, because you're not actually drawing on the real knowledge of everyone in that crowd. And I would say this, the paradox of the wisdom of crowds, and the one thing to keep in mind when you're actually trying to figure out how to orchestrate your communities to actually tap that collective intelligence, is that crowds are wisest when people in them are acting as much like individuals as possible. All right, my time is up, but I'm just going to take 2 minutes to finish by telling you one last story, which to me is actually a kind of the epitome of what collective intelligence can actually offer. It's the story actually of a submarine, the USS Scorpion, that disappeared on a tour of duty in the North Atlantic in 1968. So the Scorpion had made a last radio transmission and then vanished. And the Navy had no idea what had happened to it, and therefore had no idea how far it might have traveled after its last transmission, or even in what direction it would have been heading. So when the Navy went out to search for the sub, it had this absolutely immense search area, and it seemed like a really hopeless task. Then a guy named John Craven came forward, and he said, I think I have an idea for how to find this. And it was a very eccentric idea, but they didn't really have any other options, so they said, all right, go ahead and give it a try. So what Craven did was he assembled a relatively large team. And what he did was, and it was a diverse team, so it included mathematicians and salvage men, as well as submariners and Navy guys. And what he did was, instead of just sort of locking them in a room, he actually said in consultation with them, what are the factors that we should be thinking about in trying to figure out where the sub is? And then after that, what he did was he took each of those and he asked the people in the crowd to bet individually on how likely they thought each of those factors was. And then he asked them to bet on things like how fast do you think the submarine was traveling, what was the angle of its descent, and so on. When he was done, he took all of those bets, or I should say, he used bottles of Chivas Regal as prizes, basically. He took all of those bets and he ran them through a mathematical formula called Bayes' theorem, which is a way of quantifying the impact of new information on an old guess. And when he was finished, what he had was a map of the ocean floor. And on this map, there was one spot where Craven's team said, this is where we think the submarine is most likely to be. Now, this was not a spot that was anywhere near where the Navy had been looking. And it was also, and this is very important, it was not a spot that any one member of the team had come up with. So that instead of sort of piggybacking on the knowledge of its smartest member, what the team had done instead was come up with a genuinely collective judgment. And it had also come up with a genuinely brilliant judgment. Because a few months after the Scorpion disappeared, a Navy ship found it. And it was 220 yards from where the team had said it would be. Now, obviously, no one member of that team really knew what had happened to the submarine, or how fast it had been traveling, or how steeply it had fallen to the ocean floor. But even though no one member of the team knew any of those things, you could say the team as a whole knew them all. And that, for me, is the real promise of the wisdom of crowds. So, thank you very much.